The Yorkshire Ripper case is one of the most notorious criminal investigations in British history. But beyond the true crime headlines lies a deeper story, one about gender, class, power, and the institutions meant to protect us. Today, we're going to take a sociological look at the Yorkshire Ripper case and what it reveals about British society in the 1970s and 80s. Peter William Sutcliffe was born the 2nd of June 1946 in Shipley, Yorkshire, England. He died 13th of November 2020. He was born into a working class family in Shipley, West Yorkshire. To John William Sutcliffe and his wife Kathleen, he was the eldest of 6 children. Sutcliffe was born prematurely and he grew into a shy boy who was described as being sickly and very close to his mother. He preferred to be indoors reading as opposed to playing sports with his peers outdoors. And in his family, there was an expectation that Peter would grow up to be like his father, who was aggressively masculine in nature, extroverted, had a love of sport and socialising at the pub. It's been said that the role model he gravitated more towards was his mother, who he saw as loving and gentle, in contrast to his father's masculinity. It was a type of masculinity that was typical of that era, in an industrial area with working men's clubs, football, pubs and music venues. His father was described as being a flamboyant figure who very much bragged about having extramarital affairs. He was absent from the home a great deal. And Peter and his siblings were said to be scared of him, and he was described as being a bully towards his wife. Sutcliffe struggled to integrate socially with his peers at school and reported bullying and isolation throughout the entirety of his schooling. He was described as an unremarkable student who was not academic. It's reported that Sutcliffe's father was an alcoholic and there was violence in the family home as a result of this. Violence towards Kathleen and the children, including Peter. His father John was described as a womanizer, and when Kathleen met up with a man out of revenge, John took Peter and his siblings along when he confronted her, which no doubt shattered Peter Sutcliffe's idealised perception of his mother as pure, loving and gentle. This is where the notion came that Sutcliffe saw women as being saintly or sex workers, and it influenced his later crimes, in my opinion. I mention these things not to excuse the perpetrator, but to analyse him, because in sociology these observations are important to note, especially when you examine the era that Sutcliffe's crimes took place in Britain, and when you factor in primary and secondary socialisation here. Primary socialisation is considered a crucial first stage in life. It's where you learn your cultures, norms, values and language. And in early childhood, this occurs in the family setting, and it very much shapes an individual's identity, self-image, and understanding of basic behaviours, like sharing your toys is good and stealing things is bad, for example. Primary socialisation is important because it sets the stage for later learning, and it influences an individual's future interactions and role in society. And the family is the institution where you learn language, basic manners, gender roles, cultural practices, and moral rules. And it seems that Sutcliffe's upbringing was not idyllic. In fact, it appears that the family setting, Sutcliffe learned how to treat and view women directly from his father. He witnessed domestic violence, the type of domestic violence that was designed to keep a woman in their place in that era. In the family, Peter learned to try to appear more macho than what he naturally was to please his dad. And this resulted in him depressing his true self, and he learned from a young age to compartmentalise. Also, when you examine secondary socialisation, it suggests that Peter Sutcliffe very much struggled in this area too. Secondary socialisation is where you learn societal norms, values and behaviours from outside the family, from institutions like peer groups, schools, religious institutions, the workplace, and the influence of the media. This process continues throughout life as individuals adapt to wider social rules, learning rules, cooperation and diverse perspectives beyond their initial upbringing. When you note that Peter Sutcliffe was bullied and isolated at school, he had poor academic performance, and his checkered work history, you can see that there were obvious deficits in his secondary socialisation. Why does this matter? These are significant factors in increasing the risk of an individual engaging in criminal behaviour. Physical abuse, lack of a positive male role model, bullying and isolation at school, poor academic performance, a lack of stable employment and poor social skills all would have been contributing risk factors. Once Sutcliffe worked as a gravedigger, and there's stories of him robbing bodies of sentimental items like jewellery. Most of Peter Sutcliffe's victims were women. Some were sex workers, some were not. But early on, police treated the murders of sex working women as less urgent. This reveals a key sociological point. Violence against marginalised women is often treated as socially invisible. Authorities divided victims into so-called innocent and undeserving women. And this moral hierarchy shaped the investigation. However, when Sutcliffe killed women who weren't involved in sex work, that was when the public panic escalated, showing how society values women differently based along gender norms. Institutional sexism didn't just affect the victims, it shaped police assumptions, it narrowed their leads and even led them to dismiss the accounts of survivors. The murders took place in working class, post-industrial towns across Yorkshire. These were communities dealing with unemployment, social stigma and decline. And for police, this reinforced stereotypes that working class areas were dangerous, disorderly and associated with vice. This shaped how the investigators viewed both the victims and the environment. Economic hardship pushed many women into vulnerable situations rather than addressing structural inequality. Media coverage framed the problem as individual choices. The press named Sutcliffe the Yorkshire Ripper, linking him to the Ripper and turning him into a dark folk figure. This created the classic moral panic, a wave of fear, anxiety and myth-making, and women were told not to go out at night. Men were seen as potential perpetrators. The public imagined a monster more than a man, and this sensationalism overshadowed the social realities, gender-based violence, sexism in policing, and the everyday lives of the victims. The investigation into the Ripper case is often cited as one of the biggest policing failures in British history. Police relied on false leads, like the hoax Wearside Jack tapes, ignored survivor testimonies, and suffered from jurisdictional confusion. These failures were not just mistakes. They sadly reflected deeper institutional biases, sexism, class prejudice, and rigid, outdated investigative structures. The case exposed a gap between how law enforcement should work and how it actually operated inside a biased society at the time. Feminist groups reacted strongly to the way police handled the case, especially when women were told to stay indoors. The message was clear. Instead of addressing male violence, institutions placed responsibility on women to change their own behaviour. Movements like Reclaim the Night argued that women should be able to walk the streets without fear. They wanted men off the streets and they marched in protest. This shifted the conversation from crime to patriarchy, from individual violence to structural oppression. It also shifted Sutcliffe's killing pattern, as public pressure had caused an increase in police presence in the red light district. So his next victims were not sex workers, which caused public outrage and made the Yorkshire Ripper the most wanted man in Britain. The Yorkshire Ripper case shaped public perceptions of safety. Fear became a tool of social control, influencing women's mobility and public behaviour. This reflects sociologists Michel Foucault's idea of disciplinary power, where people regulate themselves because they fear potential harm, even when no authority is actively watching. In the aftermath, police procedures were overhauled. Systems like the Holmes database were introduced to improve investigative efficiency. This case also pushed discussions about violence against women into the mainstream, exposed misogyny in media coverage, and gave momentum to feminist activism. Prior to his arrest, Peter Sutcliffe was interviewed in connection with the investigation a total of 9 times. He fitted the photo fit and he kept cropping up in the areas of inquiry. A £5 note found in the victim's handbag was traced to his workplace. He was spotted around the areas sex workers worked. Police were thrown off by a hoax recording of the Ripper's voice. They were also admittedly accepted his words and alibi, and they mistook his calm demeanour as a lack of guilt rather than due to his ability to compartmentalise, a learnt behaviour for him, as I mentioned before. Sutcliffe was finally apprehended on the 2nd of January 1981 by police in Sheffield, and they came across a car with number plates that did not match, whereupon they arrested him for that offence. Just prior to his arrest, Sutcliffe asked if he could urinate in a bush, and when police returned to that area, they found he had discarded a hammer and a knife in the bushes. It was then that Peter Sutcliffe confessed that he was indeed the Yorkshire Ripper. He stood trial in 1981 at the Old Bailey for 13 counts of murder and 7 of attempted murder. His defence claimed he had schizophrenia. This was mainly due to Sutcliffe saying that in 1967 that he heard the voice of God telling him that he had a mission to rid the streets of sex workers. He stated that when the victims looked innocent, he was told that not to kill them was questioning God and hence the devil's work. When he discussed the murders, he apparently spoke like he would speak, like I'm talking to you now, or about a football match with someone. Many people thought his defence was a convenient excuse. Plus Sutcliffe reportedly told a prison guard, if you can pretend to be mad, you can get 10 years in prison. However, he ultimately received 20 life sentences for his crimes, which then became a whole life order. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia and spent time in Broadmoor Hospital in 1984 under the Mental Health Act. He was released from there in 2009 back into the prison system again. However, when you look at this case, Peter Sutcliffe was a sexual serial killer. And the initial trigger, in my opinion, could have been humiliation, coupled with his upbringing. His attitude towards women was most likely shaped by his upbringing and his experiences with his father. Also, it is worth noting that humiliation as a trigger due to inadequacy with intimacy. Being laughed at and judged by sex workers may have been a factor, as humiliation is an important emotion when it comes to committing murder. Sutcliffe's use of a knife is common when it comes to this type of serial killer. A knife is a phallic symbol and an instrument of anger. It seems that his view of women as saintly Madonnas or sex workers comes into play here. The good and the bad.
Come, walk with me a while.
I think that Sutcliffe, once he committed one murder, developed a compulsion surrounding the act. He can control the impulse to kill, but he found the act stimulating. And I don't believe he was a born killer. I personally believe he became a killer due to his upbringing. Primary and secondary socialisation analogy does fit here. He had anger issues, which he had to bury in order to become acceptable to his parents and to wider society. The Yorkshire Ripper Case is more than the story of a serial killer. It's a window into the social structures of the time, a story about gender, class, institutions, and the way that society fails those it deems less important. Through a sociological lens, we can understand how these crimes continued for so long and why the investigation unfolded the way it did.